The sun hung high over the rocky outcrop of Isandlwana on a blistering January afternoon in 1879. A strange silence had descended upon the sprawling British camp nestled at the foot of the distinct sphinx-shaped mountain. Thousands of red-coated soldiers moved with a casual confidence that bordered on arrogance. They believed their modern Martini-Henry rifles and field artillery made them invincible against any foe armed merely with spears and shields. Yet the tall grass of the surrounding hills concealed a massive force that was moving with the stealth of a leopard. The air was thick with tension, though few of the officers seemed to notice the impending doom. This was not merely a skirmish on the fringes of the British Empire, but a pivotal clash between two great military powers. On one side stood the industrial might of Victorian Britain, which had conquered vast swathes of the globe through discipline and firepower. On the other side stood the Zulu Kingdom, which was the most powerful indigenous military machine in sub-Saharan Africa. The outcome of this day would shock the world and challenge the perception of imperial invincibility. At stake was the sovereignty of Zululand and the reputation of the British Army. A defeat here would topple governments in London and change the course of colonial history forever. At the heart of this looming conflict was the legacy of a man who had revolutionized warfare in southern Africa decades prior. Shaka Zulu had transformed a small clan into a mighty empire through ruthless training and tactical innovation. His spirit still permeated the ranks of the Zulu army, even though his nephew Cetshwayo now sat on the throne. Cetshwayo was a prudent and diplomatic ruler who sought peace but prepared for war. He understood the grave threat posed by the encroaching European settlers, but he also knew the strength of his people. His warriors were not a disorganized rabble, but a highly disciplined force ready to die for their king. The central question that hung over the scorched plains of Zululand was one of technology versus tactics. Could a traditional army armed primarily with cowhide shields and iron-tipped spears defeat a modern force equipped with breech-loading rifles and rockets? The British commander Lord Chelmsford certainly did not think so. He had invaded Zululand with a misplaced sense of superiority and disregarded standard defensive precautions. He assumed the Zulus would avoid a pitched battle and melt away before the might of the British square. He failed to ask himself if his enemy might actually seek a direct confrontation on their own terms. The answer to that question would arrive with terrifying speed and ferocity on the 22nd of January. The resulting battle would not be the easy victory Chelmsford anticipated, but a catastrophic defeat that would leave the British camp in ruins. The Zulus would employ a tactical maneuver known as the Horns of the Buffalo to encircle and annihilate the British force. It was a masterclass in coordination and mobility that rendered the British firepower ineffective. The immediate aftermath saw the British Empire reeling in shock, while the Zulus celebrated a victory that proved their martial prowess to the entire world. To understand this cataclysmic event, we must look back to the origins of the Zulu military system. Before the rise of Shaka, the tribes of the region fought limited skirmishes that rarely resulted in mass casualties. Warriors would throw long spears from a distance and retreat when honor was satisfied. Shaka changed everything when he introduced the Ikwa, which was a short-handled stabbing spear designed for close-quarters combat. He forced his men to discard their sandals and run barefoot over thorns to harden their feet. This allowed the Zulu Impis to travel up to 50 miles in a single day and outmaneuver any opponent. Shaka also revolutionized the defensive equipment of his warriors by introducing a larger and heavier cowhide shield. This shield was not just for protection, but was used as an offensive weapon to hook the enemy's shield aside and expose their left flank. The combination of the heavy shield and the stabbing spear turned the individual Zulu warrior into a lethal fighting machine. Training was brutal and relentless, with any sign of cowardice punished by immediate execution. This created an esprit de corps that bound the regiments together closer than brothers. They fought not for personal glory, but for the survival and expansion of the kingdom. The most significant innovation was the tactical formation known as the Horns of the Buffalo. This formation was simple yet devastatingly effective in the open terrain of Zululand. The main body of the army, known as the chest, would advance directly toward the enemy to pin them in place. While the enemy was engaged with the chest's two mobile wings known as the horns would sprint out to the left and right. These horns would encircle the enemy flanks and meet in the rear to cut off any escape. A reserve force known as the loins waited behind the chest with their backs to the battle to preserve their energy. This tactical genius allowed the Zulus to envelop their enemies completely and negate any numerical disadvantage. The coordination required to execute this maneuver on a large scale without radios or written orders was immense. It relied on hand signals and the absolute obedience of the regimental commanders. Each regiment had its own distinct shield markings and headdress, which allowed the generals to identify units from a distance. The system was perfected over decades of warfare against neighboring tribes. By the time the British arrived, the Zulu army was a well-oiled machine capable of executing complex maneuvers under heavy fire. King Cetshwayo Campand had inherited this formidable military machine and maintained its high standards of discipline. He was a complex figure who wished to avoid war with the British, but refused to dismantle his army as they demanded. The British High Commissioner Sir Henry Bartle Frere was determined to federate South Africa and viewed the independent Zulu Kingdom as an obstacle. He issued an ultimatum to Cetshwayo that was impossible to accept, demanding the disbandment of the Zulu military system. When the ultimatum expired without compliance, the British forces crossed the Buffalo River and the invasion began. Lord Chelmsford led the central column of the British invasion force with supreme confidence in his artillery and infantry. He believed that the Zulus would be too afraid to attack his column in the open. His plan was to march on the Zulu capital of Ulundi and force Cetshwayo into a decisive battle. Chelmsford split his forces into 3 columns, which was a violation of military doctrine when facing a numerically superior enemy. He underestimated the mobility of the Zulu Impis and their ability to concentrate force at a single point. This arrogance blinded him to the reports of Zulu movements in the area. The British column set up camp at Isandlwana on the 20th of January, but failed to entrench their position. Standard procedure dictated that wagons should be circled to form a defensive laager, but Chelmsford deemed it unnecessary. He believed the hard ground would make it difficult to dig trenches, and that the wagons would be needed for transport the next day. The camp was spread out over a large area with a gap between the infantry and the native contingents. This lack of defensive preparation left the camp vulnerable to a surprise attack from the surrounding hills. While Chelmsford took a large portion of his force out on a reconnaissance mission, he left the camp defended by about 1,700 men. The command of the camp fell to Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pulling, who was an administrator with little combat experience. The troops remaining in camp went about their daily routines unaware that the main Zulu army was hiding in a ravine just 5 miles away. The Zulus had not intended to attack that day due to the new moon, which they considered an inauspicious omen. However, their position was accidentally discovered by a British scout patrol. The scout patrol had chased a small group of Zulus up a ridge and looked down into the Ngwebeni Valley. To their horror, they saw the entire Zulu army of 20,000 warriors sitting in silence. The element of surprise was lost, and the Zulus rose as one like a great black wave. The commanders realized they could not wait and ordered the attack immediately. The chest of the buffalo surged forward while the horns began to fan out across the plateau. The sheer speed of the advance caught the British completely off guard. Back at the camp, the alarm was raised and the British troops rushed to form a firing line. The redcoats stood shoulder to shoulder and unleashed volleys of rifle fire into the approaching mass. The Martini Henry rifle was a devastating weapon capable of stopping a man at 400 yards. For a brief time, it seemed that the British firepower would hold the Zulus at bay. The chest of the Zulu attack was pinned down by the withered hail of bullets, and the warriors were forced to take cover in the dry riverbeds. The disciplined fire of the British infantry was taking a heavy toll. However, the British line was too thin and extended too far out from the camp to be effectively supplied. As the battle raged on, the ammunition began to run low in the firing line. Runners had to sprint back to the wagons to fetch heavy crates of ammunition. There are historical debates about whether the ammunition boxes were screwed shut or if the quartermasters refused to issue rounds to different units. Regardless of the cause, the rate of fire began to slow down at critical moments. The Zulus sensed this wavering and began to inch closer. While the chest of the Zulu army absorbed the British fire, the horns were moving rapidly to flank the camp. The right horn maneuvered behind the mountain of Isandlwana to cut off the retreat to Rorke's Drift. The left horn swept around the southern flank and crushed the native contingent forces that were poorly equipped. As the native contingent broke and fled, a massive gap opened in the British defensive line. The Zulus poured through this breach, and the British position became untenable. The classic horns of the buffalo had successfully encircled the enemy. The battle quickly descended into a chaotic hand-to-hand struggle as the Zulus overran the British positions. The redcoats had no time to fix bayonets before the warriors were upon them with their stabbing spears. The fighting was brutal and intimate, with men fighting for their lives in the swirling dust and smoke. The organized firing lines disintegrated into small groups of men standing back to back. The Zulus showed no mercy and spared no one in the heat of battle. The sounds of rifle fire were replaced by the clash of steel and the cries of the dying. In a dramatic turn of events, a partial solar eclipse occurred during the height of the battle. The sky darkened and the temperature dropped, adding an apocalyptic atmosphere to the slaughter. The Zulus saw this as a sign from the heavens and redoubled their efforts. The British soldiers fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The camp was a scene of total devastation, with tents collapsed and wagons overturned. The once orderly military formation had been reduced to scattered pockets of resistance. One of the most famous incidents of the battle involved Lieutenant Teignmouth Melville and Lieutenant Neville Coghill. Seeing that the battle was lost, Melville attempted to save the Queen's color of the 24th Regiment. He rode through the encircling Zulus and plunged into the swollen Buffalo River. Coghill rode back to help him, but both men were killed by Zulu skirmishers on the riverbank. The color was eventually lost in the river, but their bravery was immortalized in paintings and stories. They were later awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously for their attempt to save the regimental honor. By the late afternoon, the guns had fallen silent at Isandlwana, and the battle was effectively over. More than 1,300 British troops and their allies lay dead on the field. It was the worst defeat ever suffered by the British Army against an indigenous foe. The Zulus had also paid a high price for their victory, with estimates of over 2,000 warriors killed. The victorious Impis looted the camp for rifles and ammunition before dispersing. They slit the bellies of the fallen soldiers to release their spirits, according to Zulu tradition. Lord Chelmsford returned to the camp that evening unaware of the disaster until he was almost upon it. He found the camp destroyed and his men dead amidst the wreckage. The general and his remaining troops were forced to spend a terrifying night on the battlefield, surrounded by the bodies of their comrades. They feared a second attack, but the Zulus had already departed. The psychological impact of finding the camp in such a state was profound. Chelmsford had to face the reality that his arrogance had led to a massacre. While Isandlwana was a great victory for the Zulus, it was not the end of the war. A small British garrison at Rorke's Drift successfully defended their station against a large Zulu force later that same night. The defense of Rorke's Drift served to salvage some British pride and distracted the public from the disaster at Isandlwana. However, the strategic reality was that the first British invasion had been stopped cold. The Zulus had proven that they were a force to be reckoned with, and that modern weapons were not a guarantee of victory. News of the defeat at Isandlwana reached London via telegraph and caused a sensation. The British public was shocked that a primitive army could defeat the Queen's soldiers. The government faced intense criticism and demanded immediate action to restore imperial prestige. Reinforcements were dispatched to South Africa in large numbers to ensure a second invasion would succeed. The defeat galvanized the British resolve to conquer the Zulu Kingdom at any cost. The Zulus had won the battle, but they had awakened the full wrath of the British Empire. King Cetshwayo realized that his victory at Isandlwana might ultimately lead to his downfall. He knew that the British would return with overwhelming force and that he could not sustain a long war. He attempted to negotiate a peace settlement, but the British were not interested in talking. They needed a decisive military victory to wipe away the stain of Isandlwana. The war entered a new phase where the British advanced slowly and methodically. They built forts and used their superior logistics to grind down the Zulu resistance. The second invasion culminated in the Battle of Ulundi in July of 1879. This time the British formed a massive hollow square and used Gatling guns and artillery to devastating effect. The Zulus launched brave charges against the square, but were mowed down before they could get close. The tactics that had worked at Isandlwana failed against a prepared and entrenched enemy. The Zulu army was broken and the royal kraal at Ulundi was burned to the ground. The military power of the Zulu nation was effectively destroyed. King Cetshwayo was captured shortly after the battle and sent into exile in Cape Town. The British divided Zululand into 13 separate chiefdoms to prevent the Zulus from uniting again. This policy of divide and rule led to years of civil war and suffering for the Zulu people. The once mighty kingdom that Shaka had built was dismantled piece by piece. However, the spirit of the Zulu people remained unbroken despite the loss of their independence. The memory of Isandlwana remained a source of pride and identity. The legacy of the Zulu Impis and their innovative tactics has been studied by military historians for generations. The horns of the buffalo is considered a classic example of a double envelopment maneuver. It demonstrated that mobility and coordination could overcome superior firepower under the right conditions. The discipline and bravery of the Zulu warriors commanded the respect of their British adversaries. Many British soldiers wrote accounts praising the courage of the Zulus who charged into the face of death without hesitation. The battle also highlighted the failures of the British military leadership during the Victorian era. It exposed the dangers of underestimating an opponent based on racial or technological prejudice. The inquiry into the disaster revealed major flaws in the supply chain and tactical deployment of the British Army. Reforms were eventually implemented, but the lesson had been bought at a terrible price. Isandlwana remains a cautionary tale about the perils of arrogance in warfare. Today, the battlefield of Isandlwana is a quiet place marked by white cairns where the soldiers fell. It is a popular destination for tourists and historians who wish to walk the ground where history was made. The Sphinx-shaped mountain still watches over the plains as a silent witness to the carnage of the past. It serves as a memorial to the brave men on both sides who fought and died there. The landscape has changed little since that fateful day in 1879. The Zulu people continue to honor the memory of their ancestors who fought at Isandlwana. Reenactments and ceremonies are held to commemorate the victory and celebrate Zulu heritage. The battle is seen as a symbol of resistance against colonialism and a testament to African military capability. It challenges the narrative that indigenous people were passive victims of European expansion. The Zulus proved that they were active agents in their own history, capable of defeating a superpower. In popular culture, the Anglo-Zulu War has been immortalized in films like Zulu and Zulu Dawn. These movies have shaped the public perception of the conflict and introduced the story to a global audience. While they often take liberties with historical facts, they capture the drama and intensity of the clash. The image of the red line of British soldiers facing the chanting Zulu Impis is iconic. These stories ensure that the bravery of the warriors is not forgotten. The weapons used in the conflict tell their own story of the technological gap. The Martini Henry rifle was a marvel of engineering for its time, but it had flaws like overheating. The Zulu Iklua and cowhide shield were simple tools that required immense skill and strength to use effectively. The clash was not just between men, but between two different eras of warfare. The fact that the older methods triumphed at Isandlwana is a testament to the human element in war. The leadership styles of Shaka and Chelmsford offer a stark contrast in military philosophy. Shaka led from the front in his early years and understood the capabilities of his men intimately. Chelmsford was a distant commander who relied on rigid doctrine and failed to adapt to the local conditions. The success of the Zulus was driven by a leadership that valued merit and courage above social status. The British failure was rooted in a rigid class system that often promoted incompetence. Ultimately, the story of the Zulu Impis is one of human resilience and ingenuity. They took the resources available to them and created a military system that defied the odds. They turned the landscape of Zululand into a weapon and used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Their tactics were not primitive but highly sophisticated adaptations to their environment. They deserve to be remembered as some of the finest light infantry in history. As the sun sets over Isandlwana, today the shadows of the past seem to lengthen across the valley. The wind whispering through the grass carries the echoes of a time when the earth shook under the feet of the Impis. The ferocious warriors and their innovative tactics left an indelible mark on the history of the world. They taught the British Empire a lesson in humility that would never be forgotten. The horns of the buffalo remain a symbol of strategic brilliance and the enduring spirit of the Zulu nation.